Hey to all you Matthew studying peeps out there. Hope you had a good 4th of July. Safe one. This is week 78, Matthew 20, 17 through 28. Greatness in the kingdom of God. So, two things are going on in this passage. First thing, Jesus lays out what's going to happen to him. And he lays it out in order, and it happens in the exact order that he lays out. And also, James and John's mother is coming to him, want to know who's the greatest. Who you think James and John said, "Hey Mom, go see if Jesus is tell you who's the greatest, me or brother here?" And or maybe she's like, so who's going to sit on your right hand? Who's going to sit on your left? Don't you think one of my sons ought to? Sons of Thunder. I mean, when he took somebody somewhere like the Mount Transfiguration, he took Peter, James, and John. They were two of the trio that always hung around. So they were pretty important. So we're going to find out. We're going to talk about that. But here, let's talk about how Jesus lays out what's going to happen to him. And Judas is present for all of this. So Jesus states he'll be condemned and to death. And so he would have to be handed over to the Gentiles to be sentenced. He states he'll be mocked, flogged, and crucified. And the disciples say nothing. And you can look in Luke 18:34. What's going on is still hidden from them. And they were so fixated on who was the greatest. And it created kind of a blinder for them to see what was going to happen. So, which one is the most important? Here's James and John's mom going, which one of these is most important? Out of all these 12. You can just see Jesus going, well, first of all, in another gospel, she says, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to say yes." Nobody wants you to say no. But Jesus is like, "What?" Or does he say, "What?" He knows what she's going to ask. So she wanted one of them to sit on each side of Jesus in his kingdom. You got to give it to her. She has some moxie. So Jesus responds by saying, "You do not know what you're asking." Probably defines a fair share of our prayers. You don't know what you're asking, child. They said, big lie. They denied, because he said, these people are going to deny me. They don't get to sit on my right hand. And of course, they proclaimed it's a big lie. And they do end up denying Jesus. And even in the end of their life, they end up drinking of the same bitterness of the cup that Jesus was talking about here. The 12 disciples died, martyred to death, except maybe John who was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. But there was no food or clothing for him while he was on Patmos given to him. He had to scrounge for his own. James dies early on. He's the first, and he's beheaded. And John suffered greatly on Patmos. Not only was he alone, but God took care of him, though, because he wrote Revelations. Now let's look at verses 23 through 28. And if you will, to reference this, Hebrews 11 through 13. The martyrs that died in faith, they received their promise. They received a promise, and that's all of those disciples that died in faith. They I'm sure went to heaven because they were martyrs. But in these verses that we're looking at now, the blood is taken for a sacrifice, and they burned the carcasses when they were doing worshiping in the temple. They took the blood for the sacrifice, and then they burned the carcass outside the city gates, because unclean things had to be taken outside the city gates. And of course, Jesus suffers outside the city gates to sanctify us. So here is Jesus about to be rejected. And And he tells the disciples' mother, it's not mine to grant left or right. Who's going to sit on my left or who's going to sit on my right? And in verse 25, I like where he says, the Gentiles like to lord it over each other. The world considers it authority to be imposed. But it's not how Jesus wanted it to go. I think to be a servant, a ransom for many, a payment to get someone out of captivity, which is what a ransom is. That's what Jesus was. He was our ransom and he was our servant. He wasn't the greatest. He is the greatest in the kingdom, but he became the lowest in the kingdom. And I think that's what he was trying to get across to his disciples, who they just couldn't get the gist of his message yet. But they will. And they pay for it dearly. Peter's crucified upside down. Paul is beheaded. So many more. They're just so tortured. Fox's Book of Martyrs is a good book to get. It tells how so many Christians died in the early church for their faith and tortured for their faith. See y'all next week.